It was the night of October 4th, 2025, in Ouagadougou. The lights of the presidential palace glowed like embers against the dark horizon. Inside, hundreds of people waited in silence: ministers, soldiers, students, elders. At the center of the room stood a wooden podium, and, resting upon it, a crimson-covered book embossed in gold, Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré, a deed. On the giant screen behind it, a Latin phrase appeared verba volant, scripta manent. Words fly away, but writings remain. The room grew still. No one spoke. No one moved. For those present, this was not a simple book launch. It was a second declaration of independence this time, not for land, but for the mind. Burkina Faso had once liberated itself with rifles. Tonight, it was liberating itself with words. And at the heart of that transformation stood a man the world barely knew 3 years earlier, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. When his name first appeared on global headlines in late September 2022, the world reacted with disbelief. A 34-year-old officer unknown to most of his own countrymen had just taken the reins of power in one of Africa's most volatile nations. To many outsiders, it was another coup in a troubled region. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it was something else entirely: the return of dignity. That day, standing before a restless crowd in Ouagadougou, Traoré raised his hand and spoke the words that would define an era: "We will fight, even to the supreme sacrifice, so that Burkina Faso remains standing." For his people, it wasn't a speech, it was a vow. For the Western press, it was an enigma. A young soldier speaking like an elder statesman, invoking unity, courage, and self-reliance in a world that had long told Africans they could not stand alone. From the moment he assumed power, Traoré broke every convention. He traveled without grand motorcades, wore the same fatigues as his soldiers, and sat cross-legged with villagers to listen rather than command. He refused to read from scripts. He spoke from conviction. His voice raspy, deliberate, and unshakable became the sound of defiance. Those moments, captured on microphones and in the hearts of his people, began to form a pattern, a doctrine, even, and from those words, the Patriotic Movement for Safeguard and Restoration, MPSR2, was born. It was more than a political project. It was a call to consciousness. Traoré's mission was clear: to restore what colonial history had taken Burkina Faso's belief in itself. Soon, a question began echoing across the nation. Why should a land so rich in gold still beg for aid? Why do we look outside for solutions when the answers are buried beneath our own soil? For each question, Traoré offered not just a response, but a direction. And, over time, those words, once carried by the wind of radio broadcasts and village loudspeakers, became immortalized in print. That is how Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré, a deed, was born, a book that captured the heartbeat of a revolution. It wasn't merely a record of presidential speeches. It was a living testimony to a struggle for identity. On April 1st, 2025, standing once again before his people, Captain Traoré announced the popular progressive revolution, a political and spiritual awakening for a nation that had endured decades of dependency. He spoke slowly, without theatrics. We are not against anyone. We only wish to belong to ourselves. The crowd erupted not with fear or fanaticism, but with recognition. For the first time in a long time, they saw in their leader the reflection of their own courage. From that moment, every word Traoré uttered carried the weight of history. And now, those words were bound together not as propaganda, but as proof. Proof that in an age of fleeting tweets and controlled narratives, one man dared to write for eternity. This, the narrator whispers, is where the revolution began, not on the battlefield, but on the page. In a world where headlines last a day and social feeds vanish in seconds, Captain Ibrahim Traoré did something profoundly simple and revolutionary. He wrote it down. The book Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré, a dit, The Captain Ibrahim Traoré has said, gathers every official speech, every public statement, every vow he made to his people from September 30th, 2022 to April 1st, 2025. 3 years of words, bound in more than 300 pages of ink and conviction. This was not a memoir. It was a manual for liberation. Each page carried a rhythm part soldier's cadence, part philosopher's reflection. In his speeches, Traoré did not talk about power or prestige. He talked about responsibility. He spoke of a nation wounded but unbroken, of a continent that must learn to depend not on the charity of others, but on the strength of its own hands. His words were blunt, almost uncomfortable in their honesty. Africans must rely first on their own resources. For some, this was idealism. For others, defiance. But for his people, it was a truth they had been waiting decades to hear. When the Minister of Communication, Pingdwende Gilbert Ouagadougou, took the stage during the book's unveiling, he called it a document of didactic, sociological, diplomatic, political, and historical value. He was right. It was all those things at once. To historians, it was a timeline. To philosophers, it was a collection of principles. To ordinary citizens, it was proof that their leaders' words were not lost to the wind. The book weaves together speeches on national security, economic independence, Pan-African cooperation, and the dignity of work. But beyond politics, there was something deeply personal. Every address, whether at the battlefield or the university, carried a message of faith, not religious faith, but faith in people. Traoré's message was not, "I will save you." It was, "You will save yourselves." Unlike many leaders before him, Traoré spoke in the language of everyday life. He avoided jargon, avoided grand theories. He spoke to farmers, miners, and mothers in the words they used, not the words foreign consultants had taught. That, perhaps, was the true revolution. A speech is fleeting. A document endures. Through the pages of this book, his language became a unifying code for millions of people who, for too long, had been spoken about, but never to. Between the lines, one could hear and echo the voice of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's martyred hero of the 1980s. Like Sankara, Traoré spoke of self-sufficiency, integrity, and pride. Like Sankara, he rejected luxury, corruption, and the myth that Africa must always be guided by someone else. But Traoré was not copying a legacy. He was updating it, turning the dream of a Burkina Faso intégré into a practical blueprint for a digital century. Where Sankara rode a bicycle, Traoré launched a digital platform. Where Sankara used speeches, Traoré used a book, a physical, lasting archive immune to deletion. Together, they formed two chapters of the same African story. One began the sentence. The other ensured it would never end. Inside the book, each section follows a pattern diagnosis, direction, and duty. He identifies what is wrong: foreign interference, internal disunity, the erosion of moral courage. He offers direction, unity, sovereignty, education, discipline, and finally, he demands duty from every citizen, not just the government. Captain Meda, one of Traoré's closest advisors, described it this way: "Through this document, we retrace the path of an unrelenting struggle against imperialism and terrorism." It was not poetry. It was policy turned into purpose. For schools, universities, and even military academies, the book became a new textbook of civic duty. Teachers quoted it. Students debated it. In markets and tea stalls, people referenced its lines like verses of a new scripture. This was not blind adoration, it was recognition. Recognition that, for the first time, a leader's words belonged to everyone. And as those words traveled across the country, they began to stitch together the torn fabric of national pride. People no longer waited for Western think tanks to tell them who they were. They could now read it in their own language, written by one of their own. Every revolution, at its core, is a battle over meaning. Who defines freedom? Who decides the truth through this book? Ibrahim Traoré gave his people the right to define both. He reminded them that the written word is not just ink, it is inheritance. And for the youth of Burkina Faso, these 300 pages became something more than a book. They became a mirror reflecting the courage of their generation and the dignity of their continent. Narrator's voice, calm and solemn. In an era ruled by noise, he chose silence and paper. In a world addicted to forgetting, he chose to remember. And in doing so, he gave his people something no algorithm could ever delete, a voice that would outlive him. By the time Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré Adit reached the streets, it was no longer just a book. It had become a movement. From the capital of Ouagadougou to the dusty roads of Kaya and the far-off villages near Dori, copies passed from hand to hand like sacred relics. Some bought it from bookstores, others photocopied it. Many who couldn't read asked their neighbors to read it aloud. Each page carried more than sentences, it carried belief. 1. Reawakening national pride. For decades, the people of Burkina Faso had lived between two worlds, one that preached independence and another that depended on aid. They had fought wars, endured poverty, and listened to promises that never came true. Then came Traoré, a soldier who spoke like a poet but acted like a builder. Through the words printed in his book, he reminded them that freedom is not something to be granted, it is something to be earned. In the fields, farmers quoted him, "We are poor only when we forget our own strength." In the barracks, soldiers whispered his words before patrols. To defend the land is to defend our dignity. And in the classrooms, teachers used his speeches to teach history, not as memory, but as mission. National pride, once silent, found a voice again printed in black and white. 2. Inspiring the youth to lead. For the young generation, the book became a map, a guide through the fog of doubt that often surrounds African youth. Traoré was not a distant figure in a palace. He was one of them, a man who once stood in the same dusty barracks, unsure if change was even possible. He told them, again and again, being young does not mean waiting. It means acting. Those words lit a fire. Student organizations began hosting citizen reading circles. University halls echoed with discussions about independence, leadership, and the future of Africa. Young women started community projects quoting Traoré's line, "No nation stands tall if half its people are left kneeling." The youth of Burkina Faso no longer waited for opportunity. They began creating it. 3. Strengthening unity through the written word. The book bridged gaps that politics could not. In the markets of Ouagadougou, old merchants debated its ideas with young students. In villages without electricity, elders gathered at night, reading passages by lantern light. Each page connected generations, the revolutionary dreams of the past to the pragmatic hope of the present. For a country fractured by conflict, this was no small thing. The book became a thread, stitching together a wounded society, turning words into shared purpose. As one elder said during a public reading, when we read his words together, it feels like we are rebuilding our country together. 4. Reviving the culture of reading and reflection. Before this book, political texts in Burkina Faso gathered dust on government shelves. They were written in academic French, inaccessible to most. Traoré changed that. His speeches, simple yet profound, were transcribed exactly as he spoke them, with warmth, rhythm, and clarity. Reading became fashionable again. Libraries reported record visits. Young people bought notebooks to copy their favorite lines, turning quotes into graffiti murals on city walls. And perhaps the most beautiful transformation of all, parents reading to their children, explaining what it means to love one's country. 5. The emotional pulse of a nation. In a land often portrayed by foreign media as broken, the book became an act of defiance. It told the world we are not voiceless, you simply stopped listening. Through its pages, the people rediscovered their own narrative, not the one written by outsiders, but the one they could now hold in their hands. A book that began as the record of a leader's speeches had become the heartbeat of a nation. Narrator's closing line for this part. Across fields and cities, among elders and youth, one man's words began to live inside millions of hearts, not because he promised a miracle, but because he reminded them that the miracle was already within them. In the digital age, where every word is monitored, filtered, and ranked by algorithms, Captain Ibrahim Traoré made an extraordinary choice. He went offline. His speeches had spread across Africa through clips on social media, but they had also begun to vanish shadowed, flagged, or buried under irrelevant content. Platforms based in Silicon Valley and Paris quietly decided what the world could, or could not, see. And so, the young leader of Burkina Faso turned to the oldest and most enduring medium of all paper. 1. Escaping the algorithm. When Traoré's team announced the creation of Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré, a DIT, some Western journalists dismissed it as nostalgia, a relic of an analog age. But they missed the point entirely. In his book, Traoré was not escaping technology, he was escaping control. He knew that online. Truth can be muted with a single click, a video can be removed, a post labeled misinformation, a speech cut mid-sentence, but no one can censor a printed page held in the hands of a free people. As one of his advisors put it, they can ban the signal, but they cannot ban the story. And so, while the West scrolled, Traoré wrote, while their servers deleted, his presses printed, and every book that left the Mercury Publishing House became an act of resistance, a manual that could not be taken down. 2. Reaching the unconnected. In much of rural Africa, the Internet remains a luxury. Entire regions from the Sahel to the savannas live outside the digital grid. But books need no Wi-Fi. They travel by hand, by word, by heart. Traders carried them across borders. Teachers used them in classrooms. And local radio hosts began reading passages live on air so that even those who could not read could still hear. For the first time, communities disconnected from the world's networks were connected by something deeper ideas. A farmer in Dori told a journalist, "We may not have the Internet, but we have his words, and his words are stronger than any signal." That statement was more than poetic, it was political, because it meant that the voice of Burkina Faso no longer needed permission to be heard. 3. The book as a weapon of memory. Every empire fears memory, because memory once written becomes history. For generations, the West controlled Africa's memory. They wrote the textbooks, owned the newspapers, and dictated which leaders would be remembered as heroes and which as villains. Traoré's book broke that pattern. By compiling every official speech from 2022 to 2025, he ensured that no one could edit his story for him. There would be no official translation, no distorted summary in a foreign journal. The original words were now sealed forever. A Western analyst once scoffed, "Who will read it?" But he forgot history is not written for the present, it's written for posterity. And one day, when the dust of geopolitics settles, these pages will still be there, whispering truth in ink that refuses to fade. 4. Redefining information sovereignty. In France, critics labeled him anti-Western. In Washington, they called him populist. But in Ouagadougou, people called him something else, our own voice. Through this book, Burkina Faso reclaimed informational sovereignty, the right to speak and archive in its own terms. No Western media filter, no foreign editor deciding what sounded reasonable. Each chapter of the book redefines what it means to communicate in a post-colonial world. It is not about sending data, it is about defending dignity. When Traoré launched the digital platform Baure Grenier, a virtual library hosting videos and educational materials, it completed the circle, the analog and digital merging under African control. While the West censored him online, he built his own network not on their servers, but on his soil. 5. The Western silence. What frightened the West most was not the book's content. It was its success. Western media outlets covered its release with the same tone they used for every African act of defiance: polite disinterest. A short paragraph on France 24. A 3-minute report by Reuters. Then silence. Because to acknowledge the book was to admit that the narrative was slipping away. They could no longer frame Traoré as a temporary military leader. They now had to face him as an intellectual, a man shaping an ideology that resonated far beyond borders. And the more they ignored it, the more it spread. Copies made their way to Mali, Niger, Congo, South Africa. Pan-African youth organizations cited his words in manifestos. University lectures compared his rhetoric to that of Sankara and Nkrumah. The West had underestimated the oldest truth of all. Nothing travels faster than an idea whose time has come. 6. When the West began to tremble. Think tanks in Europe began publishing reports with uneasy titles. The New Revolutionary Wave in the Sahel. The Traoré Doctrine. A threat to liberal order. What they called a threat was simply Africa's awakening. What they feared was not an army, it was an audience. Because when Africans read their own words, they stop believing in Western translations. And when that happens, the empire of perception begins to crumble. As one Western diplomat privately admitted, the real danger is not what he's doing, it's what he's making people believe they can do. 7. The book as a mirror. In the end, Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré Adit became more than a Burkina Faso story. It became a mirror held up to the West. For decades, they wrote about Africa. Now, Africa had written back. Through these pages, Traoré didn't just define himself, he redefined how a continent communicates with the world on its own terms, in its own language, through its own truth. The book told the West, without a single insult, you may control the satellites, but we control our story. Narrator's voice, slow and deliberate. They could silence his videos. They could ignore his interviews. But they could not burn his words, because once written, they stopped being his and became the continent's. When the final page of Le Capitaine Ibrahim Traoré Adit is turned, what remains is not paper, it is pulse. Every paragraph carries a heartbeat. Every sentence a memory of a people reclaiming their voice. The book has already outlived its purpose as a political record. It has become something far greater, a monument made of words. In villages without electricity, it rests beside radios. In classrooms, it replaces imported textbooks. In libraries, it sits between the speeches of Sankara and Nkrumah, not as imitation, but as continuation. Through this collection, Captain Ibrahim Traoré has achieved what few leaders of his generation dared to attempt. He transformed the fragile moment of a revolution into a permanent archive of consciousness. 1. The leader who wrote himself into history. Most leaders are remembered for battles fought with weapons. Traoré will be remembered for the battle he fought with language, for proving that, in an age of digital noise, the written word can still change a nation. He did not wait for historians to write his story. He wrote it himself, in the name of his people, so that no foreign voice could twist it later. And in doing so, he gave Africa a template, a way to own its narrative without asking permission. 2. From a nation to a continent. Across the Sahel and beyond, his words continue to travel. In Mali, young officers quote him. In Niger, students discuss his chapters on sovereignty. In the Congo, poets recite his speeches as verses of resistance. Each copy of the book is not just read, it is relayed, like a torch carried from one generation to the next. What began in Ouagadougou has become part of a continental renaissance, a spiritual network that needs no Wi-Fi, only willpower. 3. The closing reflection. The narrator's voice slows, gentle but commanding. Perhaps this was his greatest victory, not the wars he won on the battlefield, but the one he waged against silence. The West could control the internet, but not the imagination. They could distort the present, but not the written past. Pan-Africanism, Africa News, African Union. Ibrahim Traoré. These are not just names or headlines. They are pages of the same unfinished story, the story of a continent finally learning to speak in its own voice. Final narration. Words fly, but writings remain. And somewhere in a small classroom in Burkina Faso, a young boy reads the words of a soldier who refused to be silent. He does not see a general or a politician. He sees proof that even in a world of algorithms and empires, one man with a pen can still move a nation.